Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear is not what the headlines are telling you. This has nothing to do with protests, speeches, or democracy. This is about something far darker. Right now, the United States is standing between China and Iran like a man lighting matches in two different rooms and pretending it asks for warmth. Taiwan is not the main issue. Iranian protesters are not the main issue. Even Trump's intervention threats are not the main issue. The real issue is this: Washington is deliberately forcing its enemies to choose which crisis they can afford to lose. Think about it. China is being pushed on Taiwan when its economy is fragile. Iran is facing street anger when its leadership cannot show weakness. And suddenly, intervention language comes back into the air. Not quietly, but loudly. This isn't random. This is pressure stacking. This is timing warfare. Here's the question no one wants to answer. If China moves on Taiwan, does Iran explode internally? If Iran collapses inward, does China lose strategic depth? And if both hesitate, who actually wins without firing a shot? Because once you see that connection, you realize something terrifying. Someone believes this is the perfect moment for everything to break. Everyone thinks this is about democracy versus authoritarianism. That's the comfortable lie. The real story is that Washington is deliberately standing at the edge of two fires at the same time. And it's doing it because pulling back is now more dangerous than pushing forward. If you think the US is trying to avoid war, you're already behind. If you think China wants war right now, you're also wrong. And if you believe Iran's street protests are some spontaneous moral uprising disconnected from global power games, you're missing the entire board. One of these three players is bluffing, one is probing, and one is being boxed in slowly. The uncomfortable question is which one breaks first, and whether the US actually wants to stop that from happening. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. The Taiwan issue is no longer primarily about Taiwan. It's about credibility. American credibility, Chinese patience, and the global signal sent to every other regional power watching quietly. Washington knows that if it hesitates too long on Taiwan, the damage won't just be in East Asia. It will be felt in Tehran, Moscow, Riyadh, Seoul, and even inside Europe. Power today is not about what you say, it's about what you're willing to risk losing. And right now, the US is signaling that it's willing to risk escalation on two fronts because the cost of restraint is starting to look higher than the cost of confrontation. China understands this dynamic very clearly. Beijing is not preparing for an emotional invasion driven by nationalism. It's preparing for leverage. Taiwan is the pressure point, not the prize. The Chinese leadership sees Taiwan as a tool to test how far the US will go before it starts bargaining away its own red lines. Every US naval transit, every arms package, every diplomatic visit is not about Taiwan's security. It's about probing the American threshold for pain. How much economic disruption? How much military risk? How much alliance stress will Washington tolerate before it seeks a pause? Beijing is measuring reaction time, escalation ladders, and political cohesion inside the US itself. And they're seeing something interesting. The US is loud, but it's also fragmented. Now layer Iran into this picture and things get more dangerous. Iran is watching Taiwan very closely, not because it cares about East Asia, but because it cares about precedent. If the US demonstrates that it will actively contain China militarily and economically over Taiwan, Iran draws one conclusion: Washington is willing to sustain long-term pressure even when the risks are high. That changes Tehran's internal calculations. Iranian protests aren't just a domestic issue, they're a stress test. How much internal instability can the regime absorb while under external pressure? And more importantly, how far will the US go rhetorically and covertly before it backs off? When Trump threatens intervention in the context of Iran protests, that's not random noise. That's signaling. Trump's language is intentionally disruptive because it introduces uncertainty into Iranian decision-making. Even if he's not in office, his voice still matters because it represents a possible future policy direction. Iran remembers what happened the last time Trump had real power. Sanctions that actually bit, isolation that actually hurt, military unpredictability that forced recalculation. When Trump talks about intervention, the goal isn't immediate action. It's psychological pressure. It's reminding the Iranian elite that internal unrest plus external pressure is the combination that historically topples regimes. Washington plays a more subtle game, but the objective overlaps. The US doesn't need Iran to collapse. That's too messy. What it wants is a distracted Iran, a cautious Iran. and Iran forced to spend political capital at home instead of projecting power abroad. Every protest, every internal security deployment, every leadership crisis reduces Iran's bandwidth to challenge U.S. interests in the region. That affects Israel, the Gulf states, and energy markets globally. And China is watching this too because Iran is a strategic partner in Beijing's long-term energy and connectivity plans. This is where the board tightens. China relies on Iranian energy. Iran relies on Chinese economic lifelines. The US knows this. By pressuring Iran indirectly while escalating around Taiwan, Washington is testing whether Beijing is willing to pay real costs to stabilize its partners. So far, China has preferred ambiguity. It supports Iran diplomatically, economically, but avoids entanglement. That works as long as pressure stays manageable. But if Iranian protests intensify and external pressure increases, China faces a choice. Step up and risk US backlash, or step back and risk losing influence. Neither option is comfortable. Meanwhile, Taiwan sits in the middle of this storm, but it's not driving it. Taiwan's leadership understands something the public often ignores. Their survival depends less on declarations and more on timing. They don't need the US to fight China tomorrow. They need the US to make China uncertain about tomorrow. Deterrence here is about confusion, not clarity. That's why Washington's messaging often seems contradictory. Strategic ambiguity is not weakness. It's a tool. It forces Beijing to assume worst-case scenarios without giving it a clear trigger. But ambiguity has limits, and this is where risk creeps in. The more often US forces operate near Taiwan, the more normalized proximity becomes. Normalization increases the chance of accidents. Accidents create narratives. Narratives harden positions. And once positions harden, backing down becomes politically expensive. China doesn't want war, but it doesn't want humiliation either. The Chinese leadership is deeply sensitive to perceptions of weakness, especially internally. Taiwan is tied to legitimacy. If Beijing appears unable to shape outcomes there, it raises questions at home. Those questions are dangerous. Iran faces a similar legitimacy problem, but in a different form. Protests challenge the regime's claim to represent moral and political authority. External threats amplify internal dissent by validating the narrative that the leadership is dragging the country into isolation and hardship. Trump's intervention rhetoric, even if symbolic, feeds that narrative. It tells protesters that the outside world is watching. It tells the regime that the outside world is waiting. That alone changes behavior. Security forces become more aggressive. Crackdowns intensify, and that in turn fuels more unrest. It's a feedback loop Washington understands very well. The US media frames these stories separately. Taiwan is about democracy. Iran is about human rights. China is about competition. Trump is about chaos. That framing is convenient, but it's incomplete. The real connection is leverage. Washington is applying pressure across multiple nodes to see where resistance weakens. Not to start a global conflict, but to shape the environment before its rivals do. Power today is about shaping the future decision space. Whoever narrows the other side's options first wins without firing a shot. But this strategy carries a hidden cost. The more the US stretches itself across regions, the more it exposes internal contradictions. Allies want reassurance. Domestic audiences want stability. Markets want predictability. And adversaries want clarity they can exploit. China notices US political polarization. Iran notices American fatigue with endless overseas entanglements. They both ask the same question quietly. Will Washington still have the will to follow through when the costs become personal? That's why Trump's voice matters even outside office. He represents volatility. For adversaries, volatility is dangerous because it disrupts long-term planning. For allies, it's unsettling. For Washington, it's a double-edged sword. It increases deterrence by uncertainty, but it also reduces trust. Iran doesn't know whether to fear intervention or dismiss it as bluster. China doesn't know whether future US leadership will escalate or retrench. That uncertainty freezes some actions but accelerates others. China may decide that the window for shaping Taiwan is narrowing. Not because it wants immediate conflict, but because delay favors the US militarily and technologically. Iran may decide that internal suppression must be swift and decisive, even if it invites condemnation because prolonged unrest is more dangerous than short-term backlash. In both cases, pressure creates compression. Compression increases the likelihood of sudden moves. The US understands this risk, but it's gambling that its rivals are more risk-averse than it is. Historically, that assumption has often held. China prioritizes stability. Iran prioritizes regime survival. But history also shows that when pressure intersects with legitimacy crises, rational calculations can give way to emotional decisions. Leaders act to preserve face, not just power. There's another layer here that rarely gets discussed: economic warfare. Taiwan is central to global semiconductor supply. Disruption there doesn't just hurt China or Taiwan. It hits the global economy. The US knows this and is quietly preparing for it. Supply chain diversification, industrial policy, strategic reserves. These aren't defensive moves. They're pre-positioning. They reduce vulnerability so that pressure can be applied with less self-harm. China sees this and understands what it signals. The US is preparing to absorb shock. That makes deterrence more credible. Iran's economy is already under strain. Protests add to that strain. Sanctions amplify it. The regime survives by controlling narratives and resources. When both are threatened simultaneously, cracks appear. Washington doesn't need to intervene militarily to exploit those cracks. It just needs to keep the pressure steady and the signals ambiguous. Trump's rhetoric helps with that, intentionally or not. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a world where escalation is not driven by ideology, but by credibility traps. The US cannot easily back down on Taiwan without sending a signal of retreat. China cannot easily disengage without appearing weak. Iran cannot easily concede to protesters without undermining its authority. Trump cannot easily stay silent without maintaining relevance. Each actor is constrained by its own narrative. The danger isn't that someone wants war. The danger is that everyone wants to avoid looking like the one who blinked. And in geopolitics, the moment when no one can blink is the moment accidents become decisions. If you're looking for a clear villain or hero here, you won't find one. What you'll find is a system under stress, managed by leaders who are making calculated moves in an environment where miscalculation is becoming easier. Taiwan, Iran, China, Washington, Trump, these are not separate stories. They are pressure points in a single contest over who sets the terms of the next global order. And here's the chilling part. The most dangerous phase isn't when threats are loud. It's when they become routine, when naval drills are normal, when protests are expected, when intervention threats are background noise. That's when everyone assumes tomorrow will look like today. History suggests that's exactly when it doesn't. Do you ever look at the news and feel like it's all just chaos? A random series of events with no rhyme or reason? What if I told you that's not the case? The world isn't a collection of random accidents. It's a chessboard. Every move, every alliance, every conflict. It's all part of a grand strategy. From trade wars to international summits, these are calculated plays in a global game. To truly understand why things are happening, you need to see the board and know the players. That's exactly what we do here. We break down the strategies, analyze the moves, and help you understand the consequences that shape our world. If you want to see behind the headlines and grasp the real game of power, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Global Chessboard and start seeing the world differently. Thanks for watching.